These are the Camponotus Sanctus, and from this glass tank we built them the stunning desert paradise vivarium. How I did it and if the ants accepted it, you'll see now in this video. Enjoy! We start with a glass tank measuring 30 x 30 x 30 centimeters. Underneath we are attaching these felt gliders. With my tropical vivarium for the Camponotus habaeri from Taiwan, a few of you were worried because it looked like the vivarium was sitting directly on the heat mat. However, these felt gliders provide enough space so that no heat can build up, and at the same time it makes sliding the vivarium back and forth easier, protecting the glass bottom. Next, I've prepared some expanded clay. This acts as a drainage layer. That means it forms the most bottom layer and will absorb any excess moisture. This ensures we don't have waterlogging, preventing things like plant roots from rotting. The absorbed moisture is then gradually released by the expanded clay. This provides more security in the vivarium. You can choose alternatives, but this expanded clay worked well in the tropical vivarium and also fits perfectly color-wise here. All products I use are of course linked in the description. I fill the expanded clay up to just above the emergency drain hole in case any liquid needs to run off, and I make sure to distribute the clay evenly. Next, I take a separation fleece. This allows moisture to pass through but will keep the soil separate from the clay layer. To cut it to size, I simply place the bottom of the vivarium onto the fleece, trace the outline and carefully cut it out. Somehow, this method should be foolproof, but because the outer circumference is slightly larger than the inner one, there's always a bit of overlap when you put it in. That's not a bad thing, as it guarantees no soil gets into the lower layer, but I don't want a white stripe on the side. So I correct the cut a bit to make it fit exactly. Now for something very exciting. A piece of wood. This is part of a so-called hardscape. These are the materials used to furnish and design the vivarium. The ants will climb all over them, just like on this piece of wood. I already have some great ideas with this, and I even have cooler ideas for this piece of wood. And here I have about 15 other cool ideas in the form of a so-called spiderwood, which I'll try to incorporate with a little imagination. But now hold on tight, because here comes a stone. Folks who saw the tropical vivarium video will remember this part. And the whole thing gets even more spectacular with a second stone. This one is very nicely textured and really appealed to me. The third stone was also excellent, and it chose its long shape for a special purpose. While buying the fourth and the fifth stone, I started to wonder what I was actually doing with my life, so we'll skip those and move on to the plants. Specifically the Crassula ovata. This one is nicknamed the coral jade, and it's easy to see why. Its leaves look like little growths. They can store a lot of water, and it produces small star-shaped flowers in spring. I can't wait to see the ants climbing on it. As our second plant, we have one that sounds a little bit like a superhero, the Hoya Super Silver baby plant. With this vivarium, too, I want to avoid the ground being obscured by too many leaves. But these magnificent leaves are undemanding, and with proper care, the plant produces fragrant little flowers. Third in the lineup is something that really stands out. With Gymnocalycium Mihanovichii Variegata, we have a cactus with punk potential. When I saw this color combination, I just had to have it. And how the ants navigate between the spines will surely be exciting. Lastly, an idea struck me, and I opted for Senecio rowleyanus, nicknamed String of Pearls. It should also be clear where it gets its name from. This little one looks a little bit dried out and sad, but don't worry, with a little water it will look wonderful where I've planted for it. Now, before I add the soil, it's time for planning. I tried a few things out in the zoo store, but now it is about forming a concrete plan and also seeing how high I can fill the soil. The plan this time is different from a tropical vivarium. That one was more or less flat from the ground up and then had elevations created by objects. This time, the plan is to create multiple levels using the stones. This brings a little bit more dynamic to the vivarium, gives more scope for personal design, and I'm especially curious to see how the ants will shape it. The whole thing follows a desert concept and the stones can act like little cliffs, while the dry woods can give the appearance of withered trees. Just how to do that exactly presents me with a challenge or two. You start with an idea, then get what comes closest to it, but nature rarely grows and shapes itself to fit perfectly. Accordingly, you have to be flexible, adapt to the flow of nature, and also be prepared to compromise. After a bit of back and forth, I had a rough idea of how I wanted to approach it, and we could move on to the soil. For this, we take a compressed brick of cocoa fiber. This will become part of our soil, but first we need to prepare it. For that, we take a bowl and place the brick inside. I later realized that half would have been more than enough. Then we fill the bowl with water and make sure the fibers have good contact with the water. The cocoa brick stays hard on contact and we need to let it soak for a while. Weight it down a bit with a stone, all sides are in contact with water and you can already see the fibers swelling at the edges. After some time, fibers have gained volume and even the stone has been lifted. Now we can pour off the water and crumble the fibers. In doing so, I noticed that the parts in the center of the brick were still relatively dry and woody, but that won't be noticeable once we mix everything together. And this is the end result. Small fibers that store moisture well. Contrary to popular belief, deserts are only dry on the surface. Beneath dunes, sand and stones, there is also soil that can certainly hold moisture. As a second component, I'm using the rainforest soil that I also use in my tropical vivarium. In this, the plants will find everything they need for the initial period. And to this, we now add 2 parts of desert terrarium soil. This bag was so incredibly heavy, there's no elegant way to place it on my work surface. This terrarium soil, as the name suggests, is suitable for terrariums, so it's also safe for animals and everything around them. Now we mix it all carefully and I make a mental note to use a bigger bowl in the future. But it's kind of fun. Now we add activated coal. This helps to regulate moisture. Furthermore, charcoal has detoxifying properties, removing impurities and toxins from the soil. I mix these in by eye until I feel I have enough activated charcoal and it's well distributed. Now comes the first critical part. The way I place my materials now, they will 99% likely stay that way. Accordingly, nothing can go wrong now, and I have to trust my decisions. The final shape is slowly taking form, so I close the side openings and proceed. Piece by piece, I add the mixed substrate into the vivarium. Careful not to add too much, so there's enough space between the top edge and the plants and stones to be escape-proof. It's also good to put pressure on the substrate from now and then. This makes the soil less loose and minimizes the risk of any ant tunnels collapsing. We obviously don't want to bury the ants alive. I prepare another batch of substrate according to the recipe I've already shown. 1 part cocoa fiber, 1 part rainforest soil and 2 parts desert terrarium soil. Now it gets serious. The first stone goes into its final space. Stones 2 and 3 quickly follow. With stone 3, I have a very specific idea, which the stone, however, clearly sees differently. After extensive discussion, we managed to agree, and the 4th stone found its place. I'll show you everything in detail soon, don't worry. With everything placed firmly, it gives us an opportunity to fill the resulting gaps with substrate. Here I was worried that the soil was too loose, but also hoped it would naturally distribute itself in the cracks and crevices. Once everything was roughly placed, I could tidy up a bit with a brush, and we can see where everything stands. Then, here too, press down on the soil for known reasons. Here's our current status. Looks pretty cool, right? I think the stones look like little cliffs and give the whole thing a very natural touch. The side wall is completely covered and offers the ants a lot of space to dig, where we hopefully can observe them someday. The different levels also come out very nicely and I'm thoroughly satisfied. Now nothing is stopping us from the second critical step. That's the plants. With the plants, I was a bit worried they wouldn't get enough space for their roots, as the stones are wider than expected. However, this concern turned out to be unfounded. Above all, I think the string of pearls, with its pearls cascading down over the stone, looks really good. That's exactly how I hoped it would be. Once everything was in place, I could continue experimenting to test if it all still harmonized. Satisfied with the plants, I decided to plant them permanently. First, the string of pearls. Then, with a little trick and visible respect for the spines, the cactus also found its place. Right after that follows our coral jade, which proves to be very low maintenance. And lastly, our superhero plant, the Hoya Super Silver baby plant, finds its spot. Now I could really let my creativity run wild. The plants were planted, and I could start designing with the wood, creating counterweights that harmonize and accentuate. I thought it was particularly cool how this branch was perfect for framing the stone. I took my time here, and we can fast forward a bit. In the end, with a bit of trial and error, all the necessary things were in place without looking too crowded. Let me give you a little tour. Here, under the pearl of cliffs, we have the little punk cactus next to two pieces of wood. This transitions into a forecourt with a withered tree on which the ants will look fantastic. I was careful with the upper plateau and I didn't build upwards, but made it look like an extension of the lower branches. The step also fits in well with the two plant crowns on it without overloading it. Overall, I'm very satisfied with the whole setup. Time for few residents. Here we have tropical springtails. These feed on the leftover debris in the vivarium and are therefore useful for preventing things like mold. However, they also need moist soil to survive. This exists in the deeper layers in the desert, and the soil in our desert vivarium is still moist from soaking the cocoa fiber. I suspect though that the soil will become too dry for the springtails over time. That would be okay because a dry vivarium also means less risk of mold, but it's still worth a try. In the next step, we take some distilled water. Distilled water because it contains no lime or similar substances and therefore doesn't bring any deposits into the vivarium. It's also super easy to wipe off and leaves no water spots when drying. With this, I now water the plants. The soil is still moist, but the plants were on a long journey and it took a few more days until planting, so I'd rather help them out with a little shower. I also want to point out how professionally I handle the spray bottle. But what does this actually look like? It doesn't quite have that real desert character yet. For that, I have this desert substrate here. This has little pebbles which will look fabulous on the ground. You can simply take it out of a package with a small spoon and sprinkle it on the ground. Not too thick, but enough so that we have a good layer that stands out from the one underneath. Gradually, you can see more how I envisioned it, and I enjoy how everything approaches the idea as if I were making a good sandwich. Then take the brush again and spread it out where too much has landed. For example, the leaves should get light and the stones should be visible. I've also never brushed a cactus in my life before, but there's a first time for everything, I guess. You can also still see where the desert ground is a bit darker because those are the spots where we just watered the plants, but that's no problem. The surface water will evaporate and the water underneath will be absorbed by the soil. And here we have the final result. The cactus feels comfortable and is perfectly placed under the cliff without being intrusive. Above it is the pearl cliff with our string of pearls which will grow over it. Following that, we have a plateau where feeding can take place. Then it goes to the coral jade, which harmoniously fills the background, and over to the superhero plant, which is finding its way. Then to our dead branches with a giant tree root, which culminates into a small space for spectacle. All in all, a well-rounded thing. I'm really satisfied with the result. Above all, the elevations allow me to film super well without neglecting the needs of the ants and the plants, and the huge side wall with a substrate hopefully gives us the chance to observe the ants digging. On the other side, we also have the option to potentially connect something else or place a ventilation mesh. I would let the entire vivarium rotate as I did with the tropical vivarium, but with all the stones and the soil, it's far too heavy for my display turntable. But what we forgot with the tropical vivarium, we don't want to repeat here. A Accordingly, we apply the escape prevention right away. Here too I'm using paraffin oil again because it's semi-transparent and therefore less visibly distracting than, for example, a thick layer of talcum powder. I also found the small cracks and crevices exciting, which give the ants perfect access to dig tunnels and passages. I wonder if and where they will start. After all, there was enough space between the stones. And with that, I can also introduce today's protagonists, the Camponotus Sanctus. I actually wanted to show you how they swarm out as soon as you disturb them, but as soon as they noticed me, they were constantly alarmed. Their temporary home doesn't offer much space, but they were definitely ready to defend it. Their coloration looks like honey, but these ants are only sweet visually. At 7 to 16 millimeters, they are also quite large and capable of using acid against their prey or enemies. Accordingly, you don't want to mess with them. Above all, they also develop large majors, which become almost as big as the queen. They constantly check their surroundings with their antennae for dangers or potential prey. They are quite alarmed but probably have no idea how cute they look doing it. Normally, they hide under the cover, but as you can see, they're not messing around. They also seem to have very good eyes, and I repeatedly got the impression that they are observing me very closely. Accordingly, the following requires a bit of finesse. How do you get these ants into our vivarium now? Well, that's not so easy, but I thought of something so I don't get attacked. First, I try very carefully to close the opening of the test tube. The corner helps me out here, so the cotton closes the opening. The ants are absolutely not thrilled. Now, however, we can take a look under the cover without even more or even all of the ants leaving the tube. I gave them a few seconds to calm down, and here we have the rest of the colony. You can also clearly see the dark majors here, which stand out from the colony with their darker bodies. These are simply gigantic. And right next to them, we have the queen. Now for the tricky part. With my strongest tweezers, I lifted the test tube out of the container and used a second, softer spring steel tweezer to brush the ants off the tube. So far, so good. And I wanted a closer look at the ants. But then suddenly the cotton fell out of the opening. A little scare moment, but luckily that could be fixed quickly. And now we have a great actual look at the ants. Especially look at the huge queen posing right next to the brood. She has something majestic about her and seems very calm. Her workers, however, make no secret of the fact that they urgently want out of here. Briefly set aside, before we put the ants into the desert vivarium, we want to take another close look at them. We might never get them this close to the camera again. You can see clear size differences among the workers. It seems that the coloration gets darker the larger an ant is, and overall the mix of dark and light brown looks like crawling wild honey. And even if a gaster is sometimes darker than the rest of the body, you can still look at the white stripes between the individual segments of the gaster. If the ants consume something colored, like blue colored sugar water for example, you would see the coloration through the semi-transparent parts of the ant. That's something I might capture in a future video. For now though, look at how the ants clean themselves. You have to be careful not to stress them too much in the setup because they can uncontrollably spray their acid, which then harms them because they can't avoid it themselves in this closed enclosure. So it's possible they are currently removing acid from themselves because they are not fans of the temporary captivity. And as it looks, the queen has already started producing a good amount of brood after the winter diapause. This colony needs more space than this test tube, and as you can see, the ants are doing their best to free themselves from the tube. Everything indicates that we should transfer these ants to their new home as quickly as possible. Here's a little snack from a worker to a major before the journey, and then there's only one step left for our little colony, the desert vivarium. The small forecourt is suitable for the test tube. There, you have a good view of them and can intervene if something goes wrong. Slowly, I place the ants into the vivarium so as not to startle them. That seemed to have worked so far. The queen was relaxed and the workers behaved calmly. Now, the Camponotus Sanctus were only one step away from the vivarium. Not to be forgotten are the workers left behind in the old container, who are surely terribly confused about what's happening and where their queen was gone. We're keeping an eye on them, and they too will move into the new vivarium. I'll do this technically smart, and you'll see what that means shortly. So, back to the queen. There was only one thing left to do here. Remove the cotton. That's what I was most nervous about, because anything could happen. The ants could spread out in the flesh, try to attack me, or what was almost worse, could feel comfortable. And that would mean we would probably be seeing the queen for the last time now. That means goodbye. Accordingly, I hesitated for a moment and took one last look at the brood and the queen, knowing that separation is sometimes the best for everyone. But now the time has come, and I couldn't put it off any longer. With trembling fingers, I reached for the cotton, trying to wiggle it as little as possible. It didn't take a second for the ants to explore the new world. Smells, textures and colors bombarded them. Their antennae twitched as if there was no tomorrow. It smelled of many things here, but did it also smell like home? The ants, however, were not at all shy about finding out. Even one of the majors moved to the opening and sniffed briefly for dangers before moving back to protect the queen after giving it an all clear. I was particularly excited about the ants that would climb the various elements of the vivarium, and I was not disappointed. The ants were still tentative in their exploration, but they had definitely sensed their chance. The majors remained unimpressed and exchanged food from their social stomachs. This process, by the way, is called trophallaxis, but it was the workers' job anyway to explore and investigate. Some of them looked as if they didn't trust the whole setup. Imagine a giant moving you from one place to another and suddenly everything looks like your personal paradise. I'd be pretty perplexed too. There were still some ants in the tube, and I managed to catch a glimpse of their life from their perspective before it was too late. A kind of switch from a bird's eye view to an ant's eye view. A completely different life. And speaking of life, there was something else. The remaining workers are still waiting to be reunited with the rest of the colony. Carefully, I grabbed one ant after another. Luckily, this worked very well because of their size. However, their speed made it a bit trickier. Above all, their dodging ability is highly commendable. Birds that peck at these ants certainly don't have an easy time. But doing it this way, I didn't have to stressfully cram the ants into the test tube, and the ants already had a bit of time to explore the vivarium. Now I can simply place the remaining ants in front of the test tube opening, and the ants can orient themselves immediately. They don't know the surroundings, but they have their old home right in front of them. Now we immediately have more hustle and bustle in the vivarium. The test tube has filled up, and right in front of the opening, an active colony is out and about. So far, however, hardly any ant has dared to venture further away from the colony, but I knew it was only a matter of time. More and more was explored. Here at the tree stump, I hoped for an entrance for the ants, but it could also be anywhere, or possibly even nowhere. But that didn't bother me at first, because I was completely fascinated by how the ants climbed on the individual items and inspected all the caves and corners. And what's happening here? An ant held a piece of stone in its mandibles. What was that about? Will it seal the entrance, as we have seen with Camponotus Variegata? It seemed a bit undecided where to put the stone, but it had to go somewhere. Couldn't just stay in its mandibles. Will it end up in the nest entrance? No, it will probably find a place somewhere else. We don't need to put any pressure on them now. The colony will do what it thinks is right. And we also planned first before finally placing something. While we were observing, the ants venture further and further, climbing one cliff after another. For me, who has previously kept ants almost exclusively in plastic nests and test tubes, it was particularly exciting to see the ants actually climbing in all directions, just like in nature. Soon, hopefully, the ants would feel at home everywhere and fill the vivarium with life. Even the last and highest level of the vivarium was finally climbed, and you could really feel how the ant took everything in and stored it to report back to the colony. Every path and every corner could become a new ant highway, and just as this stick leads down here, perhaps soon the whole colony will take the same path. Overall, however, the colony seems visibly relaxed, and I would say so far the move is a success. Ants left and entered the test tube, and each time the workers brought new information to the colony. But while I was filming here, I saw something surprising out of the corner of my eye. There was actually an ant digging. At first, I thought I wasn't seeing correctly because suddenly there was no ant there, but it had already dived back down to fetch the next pebble from the depths. As I mentioned, I intentionally didn't fill out these small hollows throughout the vivarium to give the ants a good opportunity to dig, and I'm really glad that seems to have paid off. If the ants really move in here, that would be the jackpot for us. We could then perfectly observe the ants digging and later crawling in and out of the nest. The rest of the colony didn't seem to be on board yet, but knowing ants, that will soon change. In other places, they would have to dig past stones or glass. Digging along glass would be good for us, as we could get a glimpse into the inner workings of a nest. But the well-being of the ants is more important, so we're not sad about this. The other workers were also still busy mapping the rest of the vivarium, so the last word hadn't been spoken here yet. And even the cactus was explored. A beautiful metaphor that something harmful to one can be harmless to another, and individual needs should be respected. There were also small remodeling efforts at the nest entrance. It seemed as if the workers couldn't agree on what exactly should happen now. A few workers moved stones into the entrance and a few moved them away again. By sealing the entrance, ants also regulate the humidity of their nest and overall air supply. Perhaps there's currently a dispute about whether to ventilate or not. Maybe there are also concerns about potential enemies accessing the nest. We can only guess the exact reason. It's fascinating how little time ants need to react to circumstances. It's not even half an hour since they found themselves in this vivarium, and already several ants are building their new nest. It certainly also contributes that the old test tube is no longer covered and the colony is theoretically completely exposed. The ants don't know that they are safe, so they have to react quickly. I wanted to capture how this develops, and it was a wonderful opportunity to set up my time-lapse setup again. This way I could film everything without constantly disturbing the ants. By the way, I bought an extra 6 TB hard drive for the time lapses. Filming for 24 hours currently takes up about 120 GB, just so you know that the advertisement revenue is actually reinvested. But before I pressed start, I could hardly believe my eyes. Another entrance was being dug. It was like the first entrance. You think you see something and then stare at a motionless hole for 30 seconds, but then suddenly you first see the antennae and then the whole ant with a stone in its mandibles, before it disappears again immediately. What the ants will decide is probably still open, but it usually doesn't hurt to have several options. I'm hoping for the front entrance, but with the upper entrance we have a better chance of seeing the tunnels along the glass. Maybe they will even connect both entrances. If a colony grows, this will probably happen sooner or later anyway. But now let's leave the stage for the time lapse. The recording unfortunately stopped, but the ants didn't. As you can see, the test tube is empty, and around the entrance there are many ants that have piled up a large earthen wall. Incredibly fascinating. They worked tirelessly and cleared enough space within 24 hours to accommodate the entire colony. Absolutely impressive. Especially exciting is how they piled up a perfect semicircle. Only one ant is still guarding the old nest. This doesn't surprise me. After all, it's still the only source of water the colony has. A quick look from a bird's eye view also reveals more piled up earth. Apparently, they didn't dig straight down, but used the stability of a wooden roof to completely undermine it and also pile up earth towards the back. It looks as if they've settled and very well behind and underneath it, but it didn't stop there. What about the second entrance the ants dug? Is this one now abandoned? No, they also expanded the second entrance. I'm actually not even sure if this is a second or even a third entrance. Here too, we have an unusual amount of earth around the entrances and ants constantly bringing new earth to the surface. It seems as if the ants are digging themselves a mansion. They don't even stop at large sticks, even if it looks a little bit funny how they struggle with them. But in the ant wins with what defines ants: persistence and an unbroken will to strengthen the colony. I never thought the vivarium would be accepted so well. It filled me with joy every time I saw the ants crawling out of the entrances and the light-colored gas dust coming into the light like little ideas seeing the daylight. No corner of the vivarium was left unconquered by the ants. The cactus was completely taken over and the other plants were also fearlessly conquered. Even if sometimes the grip seems a little bit tricky, but seeing life everywhere made a weight fall from my heart. To see that all the effort paid off and the ants feel comfortable is so beautiful that I'm sure this won't be my last vivarium. We currently have a tropical vivarium for which I'm in the process of filming an update video. You can look forward to a video on that soon. Now we have a desert vivarium and so far it seemed like a complete success. Accordingly, nothing stands in the way of a third vivarium. And to celebrate our success, not just alone, but together with the ants, our protagonists of a video, we give them a roach as a housewarming gift. Unfortunately, I was a bit clumsy with it and I'm not sure if the roach fell into the nest or if the ants pulled it in, but an enemy in a fresh nest was not something particularly good. I was immediately worried that the ants would spray acid in their nest and injure each other. However, I had full confidence in the abilities of each individual, and as undisturbed as they continued to bring stones to the surface, I immediately gave them a second roach. This time a bit further away to avoid the same mistake. Immediately, an ant attacked the roach too. And do you know what happened at the same time? They tried to bring the first roach back to the surface. However, it went a bit awkwardly. What you see as movement from a roach are still nerves twitching. The roach is already no longer alive, so it cannot move actively. That requires the strength of a major, who takes the matter into her mandibles and with a strong pull removes the roach from the nest, where it can be prepared for further consumption. The second roach was also further inspected and processed. I saw a worker bend her gaster towards the roach, probably covering it with acid to subdue the prey. What's still missing is not dessert, but dessert. In this dish I placed some agave nectar. A small drop is enough for now. This will now also be placed in the vivarium, nicely in the dish so that the leftovers can be removed and the ground doesn't get unnecessarily sticky. The ants will transfer the sweet syrup to the colony, just as these two ants are doing here. It didn't take long for the first ant to find the agave juice and not let the opportunity pass to fill up on carbohydrates. This is also how we can color the ants if we want. With a bit of harmless food coloring, we could, for example, color the sugar source blue and then have cute little blue workers. But this would just be for fun. We could have them blue ants and we could track how the blue liquid spreads through the colony, as these ants store food in their social stomachs and pass it on to the rest of the colony through a process called, like I said it, trophollaxis. We could then remove the blue sugar source as soon as first ants have drunk from it and observe if more and more ants turn blue. But that's something for a future video and I gladly take you along the ride. A good time to take a step back. So this is it, my and our desert vivarium. A little paradise for the Camponotus Sanctus. A complete success and more than I could have wished for. The ants will now continue to dig, and I will keep you updated if they feel comfortable, if they might move back into their old test tube, or if something completely unexpected happens. Ciao.